The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Portland as Marcus Johnson pushed through the revolving door of the Metropolitan Office Complex, his coffee still steaming in the crisp October air. The 34-year-old software engineer had always prided himself on being early to work, but today felt different somehow. An electric tension hung in the atmosphere like the calm before a thunderstorm. Emergency sirens had been wailing sporadically since dawn, and the usual morning rush seemed oddly subdued, with fewer cars on the streets and pedestrians walking with hurried, nervous steps. Marcus dismissed it as another city crisis he'd read about later in the news, but as he stepped into the elevator with 3 other early arrivals, Emily Rodriguez from accounting, Jake Williams from security, and Dr. Maya Thompson who worked in the medical research firm on the 15th floor, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was about to change. The elevator climbed smoothly past the 3rd floor when the building's power suddenly flickered, causing the car to jerk to a halt between the 7th and 8th floors. Jake immediately pressed the emergency button while Emily pulled out her phone, frowning at the screen. "No signal," she muttered, shaking the device as if that might help. Dr. Thompson, a calm woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, checked her own phone and confirmed the same issue. Marcus felt his chest tighten as the emergency phone in the elevator produced only static when Jake lifted the receiver. They were trapped, but that was just the beginning of their problems. Through the small gap between floors, strange sounds began to filter up from the lobby, not the usual chatter of arriving employees, but something more disturbing. Screams echoed up the elevator shaft, followed by crashes and what sounded like furniture being overturned. Jake, using his security keycard, managed to pry open the elevator doors just enough to reveal the 8th-floor hallway, which was eerily empty and lit only by flickering fluorescent lights. The quartet squeezed through the gap, with Jake leading the way toward the stairwell, but as they moved down the hallway, they could hear the chaos below growing louder and more violent. When they reached the stairwell door, Dr. Thompson grabbed Jake's arm before he could open it. "Wait," she whispered, pressing her ear to the door. "Listen carefully." Through the metal, they could hear the sound of many feet shuffling and stumbling up the stairs, accompanied by low moaning and occasionally sharp, inhuman sounds that made their blood run cold. Emily's face had gone pale as she gripped Marcus's sleeve, her dark eyes wide with fear. "What's happening down there?" she breathed, but none of them had an answer that made sense. Marcus moved to the window at the end of the hallway and peered down at the street below, his stomach dropping at what he saw. People were running in all directions, some pursued by others who moved with an unnatural, jerking gait. Cars had crashed into storefronts and each other, their alarms adding to the cacophony of terror that filled the air. Most disturbing of all were the figures doing the chasing. They moved wrong, as if they had forgotten how to coordinate their limbs properly, and even from 8 floors up, Marcus could see that many of them were covered in what looked like blood and torn clothing. One figure below looked up toward the building, and Marcus jumped back from the window with a sharp intake of breath. The person's face was pale and lifeless, with dark veins visible beneath the skin and eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. "We need to get to the roof," Jake said quietly, his security training kicking in as he assessed their situation. "Whatever's happening down there, we're safer going up than down." Dr. Thompson nodded gravely, pulling a small first aid kit from her purse with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to emergencies. "I've been following reports of a strange virus outbreak on the East Coast," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "The symptoms they were describing, they match what we're seeing down there." Emily let out a small whimper, but Marcus stepped forward, surprising himself with his own calm resolve. "Then we stick together and we survive this," he said, looking at each of them in turn. "Whatever's happening, we figure it out as we go." As they began their ascent toward the roof, the sounds from below grew closer, and they could hear the stairwell door on the 7th floor being rattled violently. Time was running out, and their real fight for survival was just beginning. The emergency stairwell stretched above them like a concrete canyon, each step echoing ominously as Marcus, Emily, Jake, and Dr. Thompson climbed toward the roof. Behind them, the rattling of the 7th-floor door had stopped, replaced by an even more terrifying sound, the slow, methodical scraping of fingernails against metal, as if something was testing the door's strength rather than trying to break through with brute force. Jake moved with military precision, his hand hovering near the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, while Dr. Thompson kept pace despite her age, her medical bag clutched tightly in one hand. Emily stayed close to Marcus, her breathing rapid but controlled, and he found himself impressed by her composure under pressure. They had reached the 12th floor when the first real encounter happened. As Jake pushed open the stairwell door to check the hallway, hoping to find another route upward, they came face to face with David Chin, a programmer from the 9th floor who Marcus recognized but had never spoken to. David stood motionless in the hallway, his back to them, swaying slightly as if listening to music only he could hear. His white dress shirt was torn and stained with something dark, and when Jake called out to him, David turned around slowly, revealing a face that made Emily gasp and step backward. David's skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and dark veins spiderwebbed across his cheeks and forehead. His eyes, once bright and intelligent, now stared at them with a vacant hunger that seemed to look through them rather than at them. Most disturbing was his mouth, which hung slightly open, revealing teeth stained with blood. For a moment, nobody moved, as if they were all hoping this was some kind of elaborate Halloween prank, but when David began shuffling toward them with that same unnatural gait they had observed from the window, Jake stepped forward with the fire extinguisher raised. "David, stay back!" Jake shouted, but the warning had no effect. David's pace increased, and a low moan escaped his throat, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. When he lunged forward with surprising speed, Jake didn't hesitate. He swung the fire extinguisher in a wide arc, connecting with David's shoulder and sending him stumbling backward into the wall. The impact should have caused David to cry out in pain or at least react, but instead he simply righted himself and moved forward again, showing no sign that he had felt anything at all. Dr. Thompson grabbed Jake's arm as he prepared to swing again. "The head," she said urgently, her medical knowledge filling in the gaps that horror movies had only hinted at. "If this is what I think it is, you need to aim for the head." Jake nodded grimly and waited for David to approach again. This time, when the infected man lurched forward, Jake brought the heavy metal cylinder down with all his strength, connecting with David's skull with a sickening crack. David collapsed immediately, his body going completely still, and the hallway fell silent except for their ragged breathing. Emily had pressed herself against the wall, her hands covering her mouth, but her eyes remained fixed on David's motionless form. Is he dead?" she whispered. Dr. Thompson knelt beside the body, checking for vital signs with the clinical detachment of her profession. "He was already dead," she said quietly, standing up and wiping her hands on her coat. "This virus, whatever it is, it's reanimating the recently deceased. The person David was is gone, and what we just encountered was something else entirely." Marcus felt his worldview crumbling as he processed this information. "You're talking about zombies?" he said, the word feeling strange and unreal in his mouth. "Actual zombies." Dr. Thompson nodded soberly while Jake checked both directions of the hallway for more threats. "The reports I was tracking suggested a rapidly spreading pathogen that attacks the nervous system, shutting down higher brain functions while leaving the brainstem active. The result is what we just saw, a body driven by basic impulses, primarily the need to feed." The sound of more shuffling feet echoed from multiple directions now, both above and below them in the stairwell, and Jake made a quick decision. "We can't go back the way we came, and the stairs above are compromised," he said, pointing toward the far end of the hallway where another stairwell was located. "But there's a service elevator at the north end of this floor that goes directly to the roof maintenance area. If we can reach it, we might have a chance." As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, the distinct sound of multiple bodies pressing against the stairwell door began, accompanied by that same terrible moaning they had heard from David. They began moving down the hallway, stepping carefully around David's body, each of them now understanding that their survival depended not just on reaching safety, but on accepting a new reality where the dead no longer stayed dead. The service elevator was their lifeline, but reaching it meant traversing 40 feet of hallway while the sounds of infected employees grew louder from both stairwells. Jake led the way, moving in a tactical crouch he'd learned during his army service, while Marcus stayed close to Emily, whose accounting background hadn't prepared her for this nightmare. Dr. Thompson brought up the rear, her medical bag making soft rustling sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows that made every corner potentially deadly. They had covered half the distance when the stairwell door behind them finally gave way with a tremendous crash. The sound of shuffling feet immediately filled the hallway, accompanied by that bone-chilling chorus of moans that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Jake didn't look back, He could hear at least 5 or 6 sets of feet dragging across the carpet, moving with the relentless purpose of predators who had caught a scent. "Move faster," he whispered urgently, but kept his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to their pursuers. The service elevator came into view, its dull gray doors marked with faded maintenance warnings and a keycard reader that blinked red in the dim light. Jake's heart sank as he realized they would need security clearance to access it, but Emily surprised them all by pulling out a master keycard. "Building management gave these to all department heads last month," she explained breathlessly, swiping the card with trembling fingers. For an agonizing moment, nothing happened, and Marcus could hear the infected getting closer, their movements becoming more agitated as they detected the living humans ahead. Then the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that sounded like salvation. They rushed inside, and Jake immediately pressed the button for the roof level while Dr. Thompson held the door close button as if her life depended on it. Through the narrowing gap, they caught a glimpse of their pursuers, 3 infected office workers still wearing their business attire, but with the same gray pallor and dark veins that had marked David. Their clothes were torn and blood-stained, and their movements had the same jerky, unnatural quality that suggested their nervous systems were operating on some basic, primitive level. The doors sealed shut just as the first infected reached them, and they could hear fists pounding against the metal as the elevator began its ascent. The ride to the roof felt eternal, though it lasted only 30 seconds. When the doors opened, they emerged into the crisp October air and bright sunlight that felt like stepping into another world. The roof was a large, flat expanse dotted with HVAC units, communication equipment, and a small maintenance shed that Jake immediately identified as potential shelter. More importantly, they could see the entire city spread out below them, and the scope of the disaster became terrifyingly clear. Portland was burning. Smoke rose from dozens of locations across the urban landscape, and even from their height, they could see crowds of people moving through the streets in chaotic patterns. Some groups were clearly fleeing, while others moved with that distinctive shambling gait they now recognized. Emergency sirens wailed constantly from every direction, creating a symphony of crisis that suggested the authorities were overwhelmed. Dr. Thompson pulled out a small pair of binoculars from her medical bag and studied the scene below. "The infection rate is extraordinary," she said grimly. "This isn't just spreading through bites. It has to be airborne or waterborne to move this quickly." Marcus felt a mix of despair and determination as he surveyed their temporary sanctuary. The roof offered them safety for now, but they were essentially trapped on an island 40 feet above a sea of infected. Emily sat down heavily near the maintenance shed, finally allowing the shock of their situation to show on her face. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "My apartment is across town, my family is in Seattle. How do we even know if anyone else is alive?" Jake was already moving with purpose, checking the maintenance shed and finding it unlocked. Inside he discovered a treasure trove of supplies: bottled water, emergency rations, flashlights, and most importantly, a battery-powered radio. As he tuned through the static, they finally caught a clear transmission from what sounded like an emergency broadcast station. The voice was calm but urgent, providing instructions for survivors to head toward designated safe zones throughout the city. "Repeat, this is Emergency Broadcasting Station KPTL. All survivors should proceed to the following locations: Multnomah Stadium, Portland International Airport, or the Morrison Bridge checkpoint. Military personnel are establishing secure perimeters at these locations. Avoid downtown areas and stay in groups. The situation is containable, but citizens must follow evacuation protocols immediately." Dr. Thompson looked at the others with new hope in her eyes. "We're not alone," she said. "There are others fighting this and there are places we can go." But as Marcus looked out over the infected city below, he wondered how they would ever make it to safety when the very air around them might be carrying the seeds of their destruction. The emergency radio crackled with increasingly desperate transmissions as the afternoon wore on, each update painting a grimmer picture of the city's collapse. Jake had jury-rigged an antenna using coat hangers from the maintenance shed, improving their reception enough to catch multiple emergency frequencies. What they heard made their rooftop sanctuary feel increasingly fragile: reports of safe zones being overrun, military units going silent, and the infection spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Dr. Thompson listened intently to medical emergency channels, taking notes in a small notebook she'd found in her bag, her expression growing more concerned with each transmission. "The infection isn't following normal pathogenic patterns," she explained to the others as they huddled around the radio near the maintenance shed. "Initial reports suggested a 24 to 48-hour incubation period, but I'm hearing cases of people turning within minutes of exposure. That suggests multiple vectors of transmission, or the pathogen is mutating rapidly. Marcus felt his stomach clench as he processed this information. So even if we avoid being bitten, we could still be infected just by being here? Dr. Thompson nodded grimly while Emily wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. As evening approached, their situation became more desperate. The emergency broadcast had dwindled to a single repeating message directing survivors to head for the airport, but the route would take them directly through the most heavily infected parts of the city. Jake had been studying the urban landscape through Dr. Thompson's binoculars, mapping potential routes and counting the infected crowds below. The numbers are growing, he reported, lowering the binoculars with a troubled expression. And they're becoming more organized. I'm seeing groups of them moving together, almost like they're hunting in packs. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. A military Black Hawk appeared over the downtown skyline, flying low and fast, its searchlights sweeping across rooftops and streets. Marcus and the others immediately began waving their arms and shouting, hoping to attract the pilot's attention, but the aircraft continued its search pattern without acknowledging them. As they watched, the helicopter suddenly banked sharply and began circling a building 3 blocks away, where they could see people on another rooftop frantically signaling for rescue. The helicopter hovered for several minutes before lowering a rescue line, and they watched with mixed hope and envy as tiny figures were lifted to safety one by one. But their relief turned to horror when a massive swarm of infected burst through the rooftop access door of that distant building, overwhelming the remaining survivors before the helicopter could complete the rescue. The aircraft pulled away quickly, leaving behind screams that carried across the night air even at their distance. The message was clear: even rescue operations had become deadly gambles in this new world. As darkness settled over Portland, the infected below became more active, their moaning creating an almost constant background noise that rose and fell like some nightmarish tide. Emily discovered that the maintenance shed contained an emergency ham radio setup, and after some experimentation she managed to establish contact with other survivor groups scattered throughout the city. The conversations were brief and often cut short abruptly, but they painted a picture of desperate people trapped in increasingly untenable situations. One transmission particularly caught their attention. A group of survivors had barricaded themselves in the Portland General Electric building 6 blocks north, and they claimed to have found evidence that the infection was not entirely random. According to their report, certain areas of the city showed higher infection rates, particularly around water treatment facilities and major transit hubs. Dr. Thompson absorbed this information with the focused intensity of a scientist solving a puzzle. If they're right about the distribution pattern, it supports my theory about multiple transmission vectors, she said. This wasn't accidental. Someone or something deliberately introduced this pathogen into key infrastructure points. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night air. The idea that this catastrophe might be intentional added a layer of horror to their situation that mere biological disaster couldn't match. You're talking about bioterrorism, he said, and Dr. Thompson nodded gravely. Or worse, biological warfare. The sophistication required to engineer something this devastating suggests resources and planning that go far beyond typical terrorist capabilities. Their speculation was interrupted by sounds from the stairwell below, not the random shuffling they had heard earlier, but something more coordinated. Jake grabbed the binoculars and peered down at the building's entrance, where a crowd of infected had gathered and seemed to be pressing against the main doors with unusual persistence. They know we're here, he said quietly, his military training recognizing tactical behavior when he saw it. Somehow they figured out there are living people in this building and they're not going to give up. As the infected below began their siege, the 4 survivors realized that their temporary sanctuary was about to become a trap, and the longest night of their lives was just beginning. The infected had been gathering at the building's base for over 3 hours, their numbers swelling from dozens to what Jake estimated was now several hundred. Through the binoculars, he could see them pressing against every entrance, testing windows, and showing a disturbing level of coordination that defied everything they thought they knew about these creatures. The maintenance shed's battery-powered radio continued broadcasting emergency signals, but the transmissions were becoming fewer and more fragmented, suggesting that organized resistance throughout the city was collapsing. Dr. Thompson had been monitoring the infected's behavior patterns, making careful observations in her notebook, when she made a discovery that changed everything. They're not just mindless, she announced, her voice cutting through the tension that had settled over their group like a heavy blanket. Watch their movements, there's a hierarchy. Some of them are directing the others, showing them where to focus their efforts. Marcus squinted into the darkness below, where emergency lighting from the street revealed the truth of her words. Certain infected individuals stood apart from the crowd, their posture more erect, their movements more purposeful, almost as if they retained some fragment of intelligence or memory. These apparent leaders would gesture toward specific areas of the building, and the other infected would respond by concentrating their attacks on those points. Emily had been working with the ham radio, desperately trying to reach other survivor groups, when she finally made contact with someone who wasn't just another trapped civilian. The voice that crackled through the static was calm, professional, and immediately commanded their attention. "This is Colonel Rebecca Martinez, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, broadcasting from the Emergency Command Center at Fort Vancouver. Can you confirm your location and status?" Emily's hands shook as she provided their coordinates and situation, while the others gathered around the radio with desperate hope. Colonel Martinez's response was both encouraging and terrifying. "Roger that, survivors. We're tracking multiple groups throughout the metropolitan area, but I need you to understand something critical about your situation. The infected are exhibiting adaptive behavior. They're learning and they're communicating with each other through methods we don't fully understand yet. Your building has been marked as a target, which means they won't give up until they reach you." Jake felt his stomach drop as the implications sank in. They weren't just dealing with mindless monsters, they were facing an enemy that could think and plan. The colonel continued with urgent instructions. "We're organizing a major evacuation operation beginning at dawn, but you need to survive the next 6 hours. The infected become more aggressive during nighttime hours, and they're most likely to attempt a coordinated assault on your position. Do you have any means of defending yourselves or creating diversions?" Jake quickly inventoried their limited resources. The maintenance shed contained some tools, cleaning chemicals and emergency flares, but nothing that constituted serious defensive weaponry. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of breaking glass echoed up from somewhere below, followed by the unmistakable noise of many feet entering the building. The infected had finally breached the lobby, and Jake knew their time was running out rapidly. "They're inside," he announced grimly, while Emily continued her radio conversation with Colonel Martinez, relaying their desperate situation. The military officer's voice remained steady despite the urgency of their circumstances. "Listen carefully, you need to create noise and light distractions away from your position. The infected are drawn to sensory stimuli, especially during nighttime hours when their other senses become heightened." Dr. Thompson had an idea that was both brilliant and terrifying. Using the emergency flares from the maintenance shed, they could create diversions on other parts of the roof while hiding in the small utility room that housed the building's main electrical systems. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but the thick walls and multiple circuit breakers would mask their heat signatures and muffle any sounds they might make. Marcus felt claustrophobic just thinking about squeezing 4 people into a space meant for one maintenance worker, but it was better than facing hundreds of infected in open combat. The plan required precise timing and nerves of steel. Jake would set off flares at the far corners of the roof while the others prepared their hiding spot, then he would sprint back to join them before the infected reached the roof level. As they prepared to execute this desperate strategy, the sound of feet on the stairwell grew louder and more numerous, creating an ominous drumbeat that seemed to count down their remaining seconds of freedom. Emily clutched the radio microphone tightly, maintaining contact with Colonel Martinez, who continued providing tactical advice and updates on the military's evacuation preparations. "Remember," Dr. Thompson said as they prepared to separate, "these creatures may have retained some human intelligence, but they're still driven by basic impulses. We use that against them." As Jake grabbed the first flare and prepared to begin their dangerous deception, the stairwell door exploded open, and their siege officially began. The stairwell door burst open with explosive force, revealing a mass of infected bodies that poured onto the roof like a dark tide. Jake didn't hesitate. He struck the first emergency flare and hurled it toward the northeastern corner of the roof, its brilliant red light cutting through the darkness and immediately drawing the attention of the lead infected. The creatures moved with frightening speed toward the light source, their movements more coordinated than anything the survivors had witnessed before. As the main group rushed toward the flare, Jake lit a second one and threw it in the opposite direction, creating confusion and splitting the infected horde into smaller, more manageable groups. Marcus, Emily, and Dr. Thompson had already squeezed into the electrical utility room, a cramped space barely large enough for 3 people, let alone 4. The walls were lined with circuit breakers, electrical panels, and thick cables that hummed with the building's backup power system. Emily clutched the radio microphone, whispering urgent updates to Colonel Martinez while trying to control her breathing in the confined space. Through the static, they could hear the colonel coordinating with other military units, her voice providing the only link to hope in their increasingly desperate situation. Jake's plan was working, but barely. He had managed to light and throw 4 flares to different corners of the roof, creating enough chaos to confuse most of the infected, but several of the more intelligent ones, the apparent leaders Dr. Thompson had identified, weren't falling for the deception. These creatures moved with deliberate purpose, systematically checking each area of the roof while the others chased the bright flares. Jake found himself trapped behind an HVAC unit, watching in horror as one of the leader infected approached the utility room where his companions were hiding. The creature that stalked toward their hiding place had once been a woman in business attire, but the infection had transformed her into something that retained enough human intelligence to be truly terrifying. She moved with calculated steps, her head tilted as if listening for sounds that normal infected couldn't detect. When she reached the utility room door, she stopped and pressed her ear against the metal surface, remaining perfectly still for long moments that felt like hours to the people hiding inside. Inside the cramped space, Dr. Thompson had her hand clamped over Emily's mouth to muffle any involuntary sounds, while Marcus pressed himself against the electrical panels, trying to make himself as small as possible. The radio in Emily's other hand continued crackling with updates from Colonel Martinez, but they didn't dare respond while the infected creature stood just outside their door. Through the thin walls, they could hear her fingernails scraping against the metal, testing the door's strength with the same methodical approach they had witnessed earlier. Jake knew he had to act before the creature discovered his friends, but his options were limited. The flares were burning out one by one, and the infected were beginning to regroup and search more systematically. Drawing on his military training, he created a noise distraction by throwing his remaining tools across the roof, but the intelligent infected wasn't fooled. Instead of pursuing the sound, she began working at the utility room door handle, her movements becoming more aggressive as she sensed prey just beyond her reach. The breaking point came when Emily's radio suddenly squawked with an incoming transmission at maximum volume. Colonel Martinez's voice echoed across the roof, clearly audible even through the utility room walls. All survivors be advised, extraction teams are 30 minutes out. Maintain current positions and prepare for helicopter evacuation at dawn. The intelligent infected immediately zeroed in on the sound source, her attacks on the door becoming frenzied and determined. Inside the utility room, panic set in as the door handle began to turn. Dr. Thompson grabbed a heavy wrench from the tool rack while Marcus positioned himself to push against the door, but they all knew that once the creature got inside their confined space, they would have no room to fight or flee. Emily continued whispering desperate updates to Colonel Martinez, who was trying to provide tactical advice while coordinating the incoming rescue operation. Jake made a decision that would either save them all or doom himself. He charged across the roof toward the utility room, shouting at the top of his lungs to draw every infected creature's attention to himself. The strategy worked. The intelligent infected turned away from the door and focused on this new threat, along with dozens of others who had been scattered by the flares. As they converged on his position, Jake grabbed the last emergency flare and prepared to make his final stand. The utility room door swung open just as the eastern horizon began to show the first faint traces of dawn, and the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the burning city, promising either salvation or one last cruel hope before the end. Jake's desperate gambit worked exactly as he had hoped and feared. Every infected creature on the roof turned toward him as he waved the blazing flare above his head, their predatory instincts overriding whatever intelligence the leaders possessed. He backed toward the roof's edge, drawing them away from the utility room where Marcus quickly helped Emily and Dr. Thompson emerge into the dawn light. The eastern sky was painted in brilliant oranges and pinks, and the sound of approaching helicopters grew stronger with each passing moment, but Jake found himself surrounded by dozens of infected with nowhere left to retreat. Marcus couldn't stand by and watch his friend sacrifice himself. Grabbing a heavy pipe wrench from the utility room, he charged into the crowd of infected, swinging wildly and creating enough chaos to give Jake a fighting chance. Emily, despite her terror, followed with a metal flashlight, while Dr. Thompson used her medical training to identify the most vulnerable points on the creature's anatomy. Together, they fought with the desperate fury of people who had nothing left to lose, their survival instincts overriding fear and revulsion. The first military helicopter appeared over the building's edge just as their makeshift weapons began to fail them. The aircraft's powerful searchlight swept across the roof, and its door gunner immediately opened fire on the infected crowd with precise, controlled bursts that scattered the creatures without endangering the survivors. A rope ladder dropped from the aircraft's side, and a voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "Survivors, move to the ladder now. We have limited time before more infected reach this position." But their escape wasn't as simple as climbing to safety. The intelligent infected had regrouped and were approaching the helicopter's position with tactical awareness that made them far more dangerous than the mindless horde. One of them, the former businesswoman who had nearly discovered their hiding place, began coordinating attacks on the aircraft itself, directing others to throw debris at the rotors and landing gear. Dr. Thompson realized with growing alarm that these creatures weren't just infected humans. They were evolving, adapting, and learning from each encounter. As Jake reached the rope ladder first, helping to steady it for the others, Dr. Thompson made a crucial decision. Instead of immediately climbing to safety, she pulled out her notebook and began rapidly documenting everything she had observed about the intelligent infected. This information could be vital for developing countermeasures, she shouted over the helicopter's noise, continuing to write even as Emily grabbed her arm and urged her toward the ladder. "These aren't just random mutations. There's a pattern to their behavior that suggests the pathogen is still evolving." Emily climbed next, her accounting background having given her unexpected strength and determination throughout their ordeal. As she reached the helicopter's cabin, she immediately began describing their observations to the medical personnel on board, providing critical intelligence about the infection's progression. Marcus followed, but not before helping Dr. Thompson gather additional samples and documentation that might prove essential for understanding and eventually combating the outbreak. Dr. Thompson was the last to climb, and as the helicopter pulled away from the building, she continued observing the infected below through the aircraft's windows. The intelligent ones were already adapting to the helicopter's presence, taking cover and showing signs of planning for future encounters with military forces. "Colonel Martinez was right," she told the medical team aboard the aircraft. "These creatures are learning faster than we anticipated. Traditional containment strategies won't work against an enemy that can adapt and evolve in real time." The flight to the military evacuation center took them over a city transformed beyond recognition. Portland's downtown core was dark and largely abandoned, with fires still burning in multiple locations and crowds of infected visible in the streets below. But there were also signs of organized resistance: military checkpoints, secured zones, and other helicopters conducting rescue operations throughout the metropolitan area. The infection was devastating, but it wasn't complete, and humanity was fighting back with increasing effectiveness. At the evacuation center, their small group was separated for medical evaluation and debriefing, but they had formed bonds that would last far beyond this crisis. Jake's military experience had saved them multiple times, Emily's unexpected resourcefulness had kept them connected to outside help, Marcus's steady presence had held them together, and Dr. Thompson's scientific expertise had provided crucial insights into their enemy's nature. As they were processed through the military screening procedures, each of them carried forward not just the trauma of what they had experienced, but also the knowledge that ordinary people could face extraordinary circumstances and emerge stronger. Colonel Martinez personally debriefed Dr. Thompson, recognizing that her observations about the infected's intelligence and adaptation capabilities would be essential for developing new strategies against the outbreak. The war against the infection was far from over, but thanks to survivors like them, humanity now had a fighting chance to understand and ultimately defeat this unprecedented threat. Their ordeal in the shadows had ended, but their role in humanity's survival was just beginning.